This is the Open Floor NBA podcast where we talk about the league and all the big stories going on in it. This week, we are going to focus on one team and one story in particular, the Milwaukee Bucks, who have had one of the most interesting first halves of the season in recent memory. Joining me to discuss all that, man that knows as much as you can possibly know about the Milwaukee Bucks. Jim Owczarski does a great job covering the Bucks for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. We are here, Jim, in Las Vegas, where you have been for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Does it feel that long?
Yes, I live here now. much to my family's chagrin.
Set up a P.O. box somewhere here. But we're here for the NBA Cup, the Bucks making a run to the NBA Cup final this week. And it has been a fascinating year for the Bucks because you go back to how they started the season, 2-8. Everybody's wondering, will this team be broken up? Everybody's kind of waiting on Giannis' next big quote. What is going to happen with Milwaukee? Now we sit here. They are 14-11. They have played a couple of competitive games against Boston, which is the bar for this team, and they're looking like a contender once again. So big picture, what has this season kind of been like?
I mean, it's a good start. It has been a little roller coastery, if you will, if that's a word, at record-wise. But Chris, I think I want to start with the locker room has been fairly even throughout. And this is not to say they were a happy team at 2-8, 1-6, 2-8. Not the case. Obviously, Giannis in New York questioned the team's competitiveness and the need to compete more and put that on the players. So they were unhappy, but they were always loose. Does that make sense? There was never a panic. There was never a, what are we doing? Or we're doing the wrong things. There was always we like this plan. We like where we're going. We're just not there yet. Never got tight. And so to see them now win, go 11-3 since, it's some schedule stuff there, some shooting variance stuff in there as well. But it's not surprising because Giannis and Dame were bought in together from the beginning. They were riding with Doc Rivers and the coaching staff from the beginning. And you can look over history, Chris, when Chris Middleton comes back from injuries, not coincidentally, they start to win a lot more games. And so that's happening now too. So, the record and performances, sure, were up and down, but you start inside the team, and they were pretty confident that this would happen eventually.
I remember that first game they played in Boston because they played a couple of early season games in Boston, and they were competitive for the first half, and then at some point in the second half, the Celtics just went crazy from three and blew the doors off. I remember being in that Bucks locker room afterwards, talking to Damian Lillard, and just the optimism coming from him after that, where he's like, look, we're dealing with some stuff right now. We're trying to figure out some things defensively. We're trying to get a couple of guys healthy, but we're going to get it. We're going to be competitive with these guys. We're going to be able to play a lot better against these guys. And I don't know if I believed him at the time. You were more on the ground. You had your finger on the pulse more than I did. But I'm sitting there, I'm kind of like, well, these young guys, they don't look like they're very good. You and Giannis are stars, but are you completely connected on the same page? I remember that first game, it felt like Doc was talking about the defense. And it felt like he was throwing the team's new defensive coordinator under the bus a little bit there, saying, we haven't figured out this new defensive scheme just yet. But sure enough, things click for them. Was there kind of a moment or a game where a switch just flipped for this team, or was it just a progression of kind of getting on the same page, getting things right defensively? Because defensively they were 25th at one point in the NBA. Now they're 10th or 11th as we speak. So they have made measurable improvements on that end of the floor.
Yeah, I think Doc would. They won't say. They of course would want to be 1 to 5 in defense. Honestly, Chris, if they can stay in that top 10, 13 range and get the offense going, I'm sure they'll be just fine with that. But I don't think it was a singular moment. It was a progression, and I think it's a credit to Doc and Greg Buckner, the defensive coordinator, and some of the other defensive coordinator and some of the other coaches.
He name-checked Buck, and he said, I felt bad for Buck trying to figure this old defensive stuff out. I'm like, okay, all right.
And I think it's been a willingness to change a little bit. Andre Jackson Jr. is now the starter next to Dame.
Mm-hmm.
He might play 8 minutes, or he might play 27. AJ Green, vice versa, off the bench, or Gary Trent Jr. His minutes are a little more steady, but when he comes in is a little different. And so I think the switch was, to me, Doc sort of just rocking with whoever was working in the moment, sort of playing some matchup defense. Brook Lopez hasn't closed every game. Bobby's been next to Giannis, and Bobby Portis. And so, because Bobby Portis can do different things. He is not your drop rim protector like Brook is, but he can blitz and can do some different things, outside the rim to maybe help. And so I think it was the coaching staff leaning into the talent on the roster. And look, DeLon Wright hasn't played a whole bunch of late. He didn't play a bunch early. He had a big role in their winning streak. Pat Connaughton hasn't played a whole lot, but he also came off the bench in Miami to help them win a game when Giannis was scratched late. So I think it's been more of that, is the coaches sort of leaning into matchups. And honestly, going back to the locker room thing, Chris, a lot of veterans and guys who maybe thought they'd play or play more than they aren't, and they're cool with it. They've all bought into that.
Yeah, I want to get into some of that too. I think a big part of it though has to be like Giannis just saying like, "Fuck it, I'm gonna take over some of these games." He is in the middle of one of the best stretches I've ever seen him play. And that says something, because we're talking about an MVP who's had some phenomenal years. Like, put into context the stretch that Giannis is in the middle of and what he's doing out there.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is I'll start with last year, Chris, in that he becomes the first player in NBA history to average over 30 points a game on 60% shooting. Wilt never did it. Usually, like, if you're doing something that Wilt Chamberlain never did, offensively, that's okay, right? And now he's gone beyond that. And not only is he shooting 62, 63%, Chris, they're not all dunks. They're not all layups. Like, these are mid-range. These are some hook shots, some floaters, the Dirk one-legged fade in the paint, the baseline, the occasional three, although that's still under one. So now we're talking about a guy shooting 62% from the field where there's some jumpers in there. So those are strategic, in rhythm, and effective. And the ball movement is, look, Giannis has always been able to pass. I think his processing is a little quicker, Chris. Like he's getting it. You're not seeing so much of the let me dribble and then back up and dribble a little bit and let everyone kind of reset. It's happening a little faster. He's had a couple triple doubles. The assist total is creeping up as well. So yeah, Chris, look, he won 2 MVPs. It feels like a lifetime ago. His game has changed and evolved so much since then. He would say he's been a better player since those MVPs. But yeah, this year you're getting sort of the raw numbers, and the scoring is at his career high, but yet you're not feeling like he's just by himself doing it. Because of course there's Dame. Chris is working his way back, and you've got other players also performing very well.
What have you seen from him and Dame? My antenna kind of went up during training camp when one of the quotes I read was, Dame is like, yeah, we didn't work out much together in the offseason. Now, there's a reason for some of that. Giannis is, competing internationally for a little while. They live in different parts of the world. But, when you have two guys coming off a disappointing year, you kind of expected maybe some connection there. And the start of the season, I started to wonder, like, maybe that has something to do with it. But how have you seen kind of that dynamic grow over the course of this season?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Chris. So you're right. It was a surprise, because when Giannis met with us after the playoffs, he didn't play. He's like, yeah, I want to get to Portland. And not really to work out, but just to
hang out
and talk to Dame. And then suddenly, Giannis is leading Greece to the Olympics. And while I'm sure he planned for that, Dame, I spent time with Dame in Portland, Chris, and he's like, yeah, I was going to go, but then like training camp started for him. So there was some schedule stuff, but I do agree, like, while Dame insisted to me then, and as you said, that the on-court thing wasn't necessary, I think there was some spacing, clunkiness, some timing that you would think, oh, well, if they maybe had done some stuff, this would have happened faster. But to me, Chris, I think it was more, how did two superstars, two Suns function together? Because Suns are used to having everything orbit around them. And let's be real, Giannis is the Sun in Milwaukee. And Dame knew that, but I think it was still how do you truly accept it and operate in that fashion? And then talk to one another in a way that it's not, I'm the new guy trying to be the man here. Trust me when I say, like, we want you to dominate, but it's going to have to look different. I'll get you to the right spot. Again, you're not going to have to do all this stuff. Work it off. Set a screen, roll, right? And so I think a lot of that was conversation, Chris, and was that just intuitive time spent together and believing in one another, that the best interests are at heart. And it sounds so weird to say, but it's, look, Damian's a Hall of Famer. Giannis is a Hall of Famer. It's not 2K. Like, they needed to figure that out, I think, even on a strategic level, a conversation level. And then the basketball has come along with that, which we all thought would happen just right away last year. But all those other conversations and understandings, and Damian, I had a story at jsonline.com, Chris, where he said, it's been hard to realize I'm like, can't be that guy. I can't. He went 1 for 12 in Memphis, Chris, and he's like, in Portland, I would just keep shooting. And he goes, that's not necessary here. But how do I still find a way to win when this is happening? So I think all that stuff, that's what took time, as opposed to the two-man game, which now we're seeing, or they're seeing the fruits of that.
Is there any better day-to-day interview than Damian Lillard? Like, Giannis might be a close second.
Pretty
He's
good.
right
Yeah,
there.
I was about to say.
You got two guys there that in just a scrum will just let rip.
Yeah.
Say whatever they're feeling in that moment.
I mean, locally, it is. We are a little spoiled now. The few of us in Milwaukee to get those guys on a daily basis, and then he's going to
be in Denver and have like Jokic ignoring you all the time.
I mean, and he's going to hate that I say this, but shout out to Brook Lopez. We get to see him on a daily basis, and he's also quite hilarious and giving. But you're right. It is. And then to have two guys who are so willing to talk about basketball and what they're seeing, how they're seeing it, let alone sort of the extra stuff to kind of give you insights into how it's working, or in some cases not. And then you've got Doc Rivers as a head coach. It's a pretty remarkable group, which I think goes back to the earlier conversation, Chris, of like the locker room being okay when it was going poorly early. Because I think it's just guys who've kind of been through it, and then they're so used to the spotlight in a way that, anything we ask isn't really going to rattle them or put them on edge.
So the locker room was okay, but was the front office okay with the way that the season started? Because this is a team that is built to win with this group. There's really no flexibility here. Like, there's no way to get markedly better because they've made their moves. They made the Drew Holiday deal. They made the Damian Lillard deal. They made all the deals that put this team together. Like, when you are walking around the Forum there in Milwaukee and you're seeing John Horst and his lieutenants kind of there during that tough stretch, like how unnerved do you think they were during that start?
Yeah, I mean, whether they were okay or not, I mean, they kind of had to eat it however it was going to go, because there was no flexibility. It was 3 roster spots at minimums, and it was DeLon Wright, Gary Trent Jr., and Taurean Prince, and that's it. And they were all very happy with that. I mean, on paper, Chris, I mean, especially after Trent signed, it was like, wow, the Bucks really, scored on these minimums.
Veteran rotation players, getting those guys for minimums is a win.
And so when DeLon Wright is benched early for a two-way player in Ryan Rollins, that probably didn't feel great. When Gary Trent is signed to start and shoots like 20% from 3, which is insane, and then has to be moved out of the starting, I'm sure that didn't feel great. Like, if you're the front office, like, wait a minute, Taurean Prince has been fantastic. So almost, he's been so good. But if you're batting 1 out of 3, but I would say, 2-8, I'm sure they're feeling it a little bit because, ownership's writing a check. And you probably have to answer the call, like, what's happening? And to the players' credit, they're like, well, if this had happened in February, it's like, oh, the Bucks have slumped, dog days. It just so happened to start with that bad one in the win column for 2 weeks, right? But I think if you're sitting there now on the eve of an NBA Cup championship against Oklahoma City, you're seeing a draft pick in Andre Jackson Jr. carve out a role, an undrafted player in AJ Green carve out a role. Gary Trent has found his way. DeLon Wright, maybe his usage is not what you anticipated, but it's come at the expense, if you will, of these other. So maybe you're not feeling some kind of way about that. So, yeah, Chris, I'm sure. Look, players were trying to be loose again. No one was happy. I'm not saying maybe some people weren't a little tight, but this group has been through so much in the last 5-6 years that I don't know if anyone really panics in Milwaukee in that way, because they've won so much. They've had some ups and downs. It's not new. 2-8 was new, but I don't think there was a lack of belief in what they built. It was just, when would it get there?
So Giannis doesn't keep them on pins and needles at all, because his outspokenness over the last couple of years about, hey, I'm here to win. If I can't win here, I'll go somewhere else. And the fact that we know, it doesn't matter what a contract says. If a guy says he doesn't want to play someplace anymore, a guy's not going to play there anymore. That doesn't keep them on edge out there.
It's hard to say no, because he's him. Yeah. He's one of the few guys in the league who probably has, not probably, he has that juice. What I will say this, though, Chris, it's an interesting question, because locally, Giannis is interesting because, first of all, he has signed a contract extension at every opportunity with this team. And I've been around Giannis since he was drafted. Usually when a contract is just signed, he says, well, I'm here as long as they want me. Literally on the day they announced his last extension, in that press conference, he's like, he just signed for 3 more years. It's like, well, if they want me, I'll be here. And then as he gets close to the end of a contract, he says, well, I want to win, and as long as they want to win, I'll be here. And I'm not discounting the feelings behind that, but those are things he has said or some version of that for 6-8 years now. It's just that and I'm not saying they're untrue, but it's just sort of what he says. But I think, Chris, in the context of who he is, and honestly how quickly the news cycle churns, the next time he says it, it's, oh my goodness. Yeah, and that's just the conversation. So yeah, of course, they make these moves that they've made with coaches, with players, to surround him with the best talent they can get, and it is to win. I'm not saying they don't feel that pressure. It's a really expensive team, has been. But I think he has done nothing to indicate that he wants out or has ever wanted out or even applied that pressure to say, I will leave. It's some version of those words that they've heard for a long time. Again, I'm sure they feel some kind of way about it. They want him to stay. They want him to feel good. But I don't know if in town, Chris, it's as hand-wringy as maybe it's perceived outside of Milwaukee.
Outside for sure. When Milwaukee was 2-8, the trade machine was humming. It was humming, Jim. Where is Giannis going to go next? Everybody has already got Dame down to the 305, sent him down to Miami, where everybody thought he was going to go to begin with. It's we're rebuilding in Milwaukee, but they've turned it around. And you brought up the young guys, and this is always what it comes down to. Stars win championships, yes, but it's how you fill in the spots around stars, and how many of these mid to late first-round draft picks, or in this case, undrafted guys that you hit on, make it an enormous difference. And look, at the start of the season, whether it was Jackson or Green, I don't think you were getting the kind of production that they needed from them. But now they've become key rotation players, and that to me is a massive difference with this team.
For sure. Because look, Gary Trent was immediately one of the youngest players on the team, and he's an 8-year veteran, right? Or 7-year veteran. So yeah, to have Doc see something in Andre to move him into the starting lineup, to play next to Dame is big. Like he is truly developing this year, Chris. Andre made some mistakes early in the year that got him yanked off the floor, and then you do not see those same mistakes. There are still some issues here or there. There was one game, I think he threw the ball away, and I think Bobby actually turned around and told Doc, like, all right, he knows. You know, he's just got to play through this. AJ played almost right away under Doc because he showed up and was like, who's this guy who just makes all these threes in practice? And you need that type of floor spacer around Giannis anyway. And I think at 6'4", Chris, he's a much bigger guy than it looks. And right now he's going through I'm now playing 24 minutes as an undrafted second-year guy on some stars, and now I'm getting 4 fouls, 5 fouls, 6 fouls. So AJ's going through that now, that learning curve, whereas Andre went through that earlier in the year. But it is a big deal because, look, that Chris Middleton's coming off surgeries. He's 30-something years old. Do you want him playing 35, 36 a game now? No, right? You need AJ Green to fill in. So yeah, without a doubt, those two guys, it's just two, but when you're talking about an 8.5 person rotation in the playoffs, this experience for them, even if now they're going to play short bursts at times against the Boston or whomever it may be, Cleveland, they'll be ready for it.
So Middleton's back. And as you said, good things tend to happen to Milwaukee when Chris Middleton comes back. It was weird over the last month or so, kind of hearing stuff about, well, he's cleared medically, but he's just not there yet where he can get back on the floor. What have we seen from the last couple of weeks? And what are reasonable expectations for Chris Middleton?
Yeah, it's been interesting, Chris. Let me preface it with last year when the big three played together, and it was mostly under Adrian Griffin. And there's a reason they were, 30-13, 31-13, is because Giannis, Dame, and Chris played almost all of those games together. And you could see a bit of how this could work, but too many times it was very individual, very your turn, my turn, his turn type of stuff. Doc's hired, Chris gets hurt, then Giannis and Dame get hurt. And we don't know. To me, Chris, that was honestly the biggest question about this team was how the three would all play together. Chris, this long recovery from double ankle surgery. And so, yeah, now he's back. And what I've seen to me is a relatively seamless transition into what Dame and Giannis had going in the ball movement, in playing off one another, in that Chris's shot hasn't really arrived. There was a game a couple of games ago, Chris, he took 2 shots. That's very un-Middleton-like, but he had 8 assists and a couple steals. And he had 6 assists and 7 assists. And not that he wasn't a facilitator, but to see him just sort of just fit right in to what he was watching his team do has only added to that. And now it's going to unlock some stuff, Chris. Locally, the Chris Giannis lob dunk situation, it's either in the pick and roll or out of a baseline, are like 2 to 8 points a game that Giannis has not. I don't know if he caught more than 3 lob dunks up to this point. And we're talking about his numbers. That's a part of this offense that was totally missing. Another end of game threat along with Dame. And so that's the expectation. I don't think if Dame's okay averaging 24 to 26 points a game now, Chris is probably going to be, if he was 20, 15 to 17. But if he's 12, 7 and 6 or 12, 9 and 8, it doesn't sound sexy, Chris, but that means they're probably rolling on an offensive level that is really hard to stop. So I think that's probably the expectation is keep the ball movement going. He'll get his eventually. Maybe he gets hot and they're just feeding at him, but they've done that with just role players as well as Giannis and Dame, right? So I think if he gets to his full minutes workload, that's the thought is he can get Giannis more easier buckets, which seems absurd. I'm really interested to see, though, how he helps Dame in that way because you've got that extra ball handler and a guy in the post who could command some double teams.
they have more than enough firepower to be a top 5 offensive team. Like they're that good. The improvements defensively have been the most noticeable stuff, where they were so bad early on in the season and they've gotten to that kind of top 10-ish type of level. How sustainable do you think that is? Because that to me is going to be the key. How they compete with Boston, with New York, with Cleveland. They've got a big date against Cleveland coming up end of the week. That's the difference maker right there, right? Like, can they be a top 10 defensive team?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question, and that's the hard part, because I think there are going to be bad matchups for them. I mean, teams that want to run and push pace and really get out in transition, even off makes, Chris, like that. This team has to be so disciplined for 48 minutes, and let's be real, that's a hard thing to do for any NBA team. So I think there are going to be some games where it's like, the Atlanta game coming into this one, Chris, where they just, all the bad things from that 2-8 start you saw, like guys just running around and dunking on them, those are going to happen. And so I think, are they going to finish in the top 10 defensively? I don't know, but I think it's still top half. I think for them, though, I think it can be enough. And then when you get to the playoffs where you have days in between and you're drilling down and you're asking for that focus, we've seen the core of this team do that. Like, there aren't any questions about Brook, Giannis, Bobby for what he does, Chris, Pat, if he's needed off the bench. I don't think there are a ton of questions about Dame in crunch time. We've seen him step up. You mentioned the Boston game you were at. He didn't make a whole lot of shots in that game, but he was at least involved and engaged defensively. He has been that in these bigger games. I think he wants that. And then you're talking about actual, like, Andre is the defensive guy, Gary Trent Jr., if they bring DeLon right up. Yeah, so I think, Chris, for the playoffs, it's there. Over the next 50, 60 games, there's going to be, I think we're going to see this, and it'll probably average out into a top half defensive team.
We've talked a little bit about Doc, who was a controversial hire last year, to say the least. AG was 31-13. You don't fire coaches when they're sitting there. I mean, the guy was the all-star. He was the all-star coach. That's just a remarkable set of circumstances when you go back and look at it. And it didn't end well for Doc after year one. In year two, like, what have you seen there? Like, how is he kind of settled into this job? And, like, where is he making the biggest impacts?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the looseness we open this pod with, Chris, it does start from the coach. I think if your coach is wound tight or is... If Doc was sort of just going off on players or whatever it may be, like, that could change things. I think he's been fairly level as well, understanding where they were going. And he would say, well, I don't know when it's going to happen, but I believe in it. Well, that kind of trickled down for sure. And I do think, look, there are a lot of assistant coaches. We mentioned Greg Buckner, Dave Yeager. I mean, Joe Prunty, some holdovers also from previous staffs. Like, is he the CEO coach? Maybe. But if that's the case, then the messages are getting through. Darvin Ham's on the staff. He's back as well. So I think time has allowed maybe those voices to settle. Who's doing what with whom? What's the messaging? That's also clicking, Chris. So I think Doc, for whatever his foibles are, and every coach has them, he's a fit for this team. And so, I mean, we'll see down the line, right? He knows all the questions will start again and come the playoffs, right? About when the last time he helped a team advance to a conference finals or finals. But for now, Chris, I think he was the right guy to get to Giannis, to get to Dame, to get to Chris, the stars, to get them to buy in or help them to buy in. So we'll see. They got to win more games. I think he's just over 500 now as the Bucks coach. He'll acknowledge that's not good enough. So we'll see from here on out. But I do think, Chris, it was the right guy for this team, and we'll find out if it was the right guy overall.
He is excellent at getting through to veteran players. I mean, we saw it practice the other day. I mean, Kevin Garnett was there. You see Rajon Rondo around now. This team, Coach Rondo, working with the Bucks. I mean, that. Speaking of basketball minds, Rondo has one of the best basketball minds you're ever going to see around the game. Yeah, it is. It has been interesting to see him kind of settle into this job, and yeah, I do think. I mean, Dame's got a lot to prove in the playoffs, or at least opportunities in the playoffs. Giannis certainly has a lot to prove now, the last couple of years, but Doc more than anyone. Like, he's everybody knows, like you said, the record, the resume, all that. It's going to be interesting to watch, to say the least. I am still envious of your ability to get to talk to Giannis and Dame every single day. It's got to be a lot of fun to do that.
It is,
because those guys are fantastic.
It is. Dame may not. Dame doesn't have the dad jokes that Giannis has. He's a little more serious.
You just got to stop watching boxing, Jim. If you want to get to Dame.
We do. We
just start watching.
We do have those conversations. He lets me know that I'm a casual, but that's fine. I am.
Every interview I do with Damian Lillard, it starts with 90% of boxing talk, and then we pivot to like the 10% of the good basketball stuff. Okay, let's get through Jaime Munguia's knockout loss, and then we'll talk more about your pick and roll defense this year and how it's picked up. Jim, thanks for coming in studio, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.